Ever get yourself just thinking about like the big questions, you know?
Yeah.
Like, what even is consciousness really, and what happens when we die?
Yeah.
Well, today we're diving into a seriously interesting idea. It could be huge. We're going to see what some pretty surprising scientific research might be telling us.
Yeah, there's some fascinating stuff in this research you sent me. Like the idea that our consciousness, who we are, that it might not just disappear when we die. And what's really cool is that it's not just coming from, philosophers or something. We're seeing some unexpected clues coming from research in quantum computing.
For real.
Yeah.
And we've even got reactions from like straight up physics heavy hitters in here. I mean, Brian Cox, you don't often see him like genuinely surprised by something, do you?
No, you really don't. And it's important to understand what we're dealing with here, right? We're not just talking about theories and speculation. These sources are pointing to some pretty advanced stuff. AI models running on quantum computers, crunching mountains of data on how our brains work. And then, get this, they're combining that with data from the quantum world, which is crazy to think about.
That's what makes this so interesting, right? It's not just what if anymore. We've got these powerful computers running models, and they're spitting out some wild results. The source material even mentions a shocking truth. Like, come on, we've got to unpack that, right? Feels like this could really change how we think about, well, everything. Okay, so first things first. What exactly did these quantum computers find out that's got everyone buzzing?
So what's really interesting is the experiment itself. They took all this data on brain activity, really detailed stuff, and they combined it with all this quantum data. And they fed it into a really sophisticated quantum AI system. Basically, they wanted to create a model, a fundamental model of consciousness.
Okay, so they built this model, but it didn't exactly say what conventional neuroscience would expect, right? Like it didn't say consciousness is neatly tucked away inside the brain.
Right. The results were kind of radical, actually. The AI's simulations were pointing to something pretty different, that consciousness isn't stuck inside the physical brain. Instead, the data seemed to show that it operates in a quantum state. I mean, it's less about being in multiple places at once, like physically, and more about existing in all these possibilities at the same time until it's measured, which is this mind-blowing idea called superposition.
Got it. So consciousness is kind of like quantum information then,
Yeah.
existing in this weird quantum way. So what happens when we die, if that's the case?
This is where it gets really interesting. Quantum information, in theory, never really vanishes. It just kind of transforms or gets entangled with other systems. So the suggestion here is that because consciousness has this quantum nature, maybe it also persists even after our brains stop working.
So it's not like lights out, the end, more like changing channels,
That's the idea they're exploring. Maybe our individual awareness, who we are, is just a part of this much bigger, interconnected quantum field. So then death wouldn't be the end of the line, just a change within this field, like a transformation of our consciousness, not just poof, gone. But it makes you wonder what form that consciousness would take and how it interacts with this larger field.
I know, right? It's a total mind trip. Now, the source material mentions how Brian Cox reacted to all this. He's like the physics guy, super grounded in that world. So what did he think?
You could tell he was surprised, really surprised. Even for someone who spent a lot of time thinking about quantum mechanics and how it connects to consciousness, this seemed to catch him off guard.
He's no stranger to weird quantum stuff like the observer effect and all
Yeah.
that. So how did his understanding of that play into his reaction, according to the source?
Exactly. He's talked about how just observing quantum particles can change how they act, which suggests consciousness plays a role in shaping reality, or at least how we see it. The source material says that he admits mainstream neuroscience says consciousness comes from our brains, but quantum mechanics throws a wrench in that idea. It opens up possibilities that totally contradict that assumption.
So it sounds like he's not jumping on board with this idea of consciousness surviving death, but he's not saying it's impossible either, right?
Yeah, I'd say that's a fair assessment based on what we see here. He's definitely skeptical, which makes sense, and he points out that we don't have any solid scientific proof yet. But here's the really important part. He says physics hasn't figured out what consciousness really is, where it comes from, what it's made of, and whether it ends when we die. And that's huge, coming from a guy like him.
It makes you wonder how much we actually know, right? Okay, the source also talks about simulation theory. How does this quantum computing discovery tie into the idea that our reality might be a simulation?
Well, it makes you ask some pretty big questions about what's real. The idea is that if reality is made up of quantum information at its most basic level, and if quantum computing is showing us patterns that look a lot like how computers work, then maybe we're living in some kind of super complex computer simulation. It's a wild thought, but it's not totally crazy.
Whoa. So if that were true, how would that change how we think about consciousness and death? Like, would it even be death?
If our consciousness is part of this computer program, this simulated reality, instead of just being a product of our brains, then death would be something totally different. It wouldn't be the end, but more like a change within the system. Like the source suggests, maybe consciousness could be moved, copied, or even exist without a body in this simulation. Imagine what that would mean for who we are, our identity, and whether our experiences continue.
It's like a cosmic backup and restore.
Yeah.
Wild. Now, there's also this idea of consciousness existing as a quantum field. What's that about?
This is a really interesting idea. It says that consciousness isn't stuck in our heads, but it's part of this massive interconnected quantum field, like a fundamental energy field that's everywhere. And our individual consciousness, who we are, is just a little ripple in this giant field.
How does that connect to quantum entanglement? That spooky action at a distance thing they talk about.
That's the key. Quantum entanglement shows us that particles can stay connected even when they're really far apart and can instantly affect each other. The theory is that consciousness might work in a similar way. If each of us is like a node in this huge field connected through quantum entanglement, it could explain some of those weird human experiences that are hard to understand.
I'm curious, like what kind of experiences? The source mentioned a few, right?
Yeah. Right. Things like near-death experiences where people report all these vivid things even though their brains aren't really active. Or those moments of shared consciousness or strong intuition where you just know something without knowing how you know it. Even those strange feelings of recognizing something you've never seen before or remembering something that never happened to you. If consciousness is part of this big interconnected field, maybe those experiences are glimpses into other parts of the field.
So death might not mean our consciousness is destroyed, but instead it shifts into a different form within this field.
That's the implication. Some researchers think that because of something called quantum coherence, a really delicate state where quantum systems stay connected, the information that makes up our consciousness could actually stick around even after we die. Makes you wonder what that information would be like and whether it would still be, you.
Crazy stuff, right? And the fact that these advanced AI models are coming up with these ideas is pretty wild. Okay, let's talk about something a lot of people have experienced. Near-death experiences, or NDEs. How do those fit into this whole quantum picture?
NDEs are super fascinating, and quantum physics might give us a way to understand them. The source points out that a lot of people who've been clinically dead describe similar experiences, like bright lights, feeling super peaceful, or seeing loved ones who have passed away.
The skeptical view is that these experiences are just the brain going haywire as it shuts down, but there's another explanation emerging from this quantum perspective, right?
Right. The quantum explanation suggests that when someone dies, their consciousness, which has this quantum nature, might briefly disconnect from the brain. And during that time, it could interact with the quantum field, which might explain those vivid experiences people report. Quantum coherence in the brain might also allow some awareness to continue even when the body's stopped working. It raises some really interesting questions about how we perceive things and what awareness means outside the physical body.
So maybe NDEs aren't just random brain activity. As the source suggests, they could be actual glimpses of consciousness transitioning to another state. That's a pretty big shift in thinking about those experiences.
Yeah, it definitely challenges the traditional view of the mind and body and what happens when we die.
Okay, the source also brings up the multiverse theory. The idea that there are multiple universes existing at the same time. How does that relate to consciousness and what happens after death?
The multiverse theory basically says that every possibility, every outcome of a quantum event creates a separate reality. If our consciousness is fundamentally quantum, like the AI research suggests, then dying in one universe, like the one we experience, might not be the end of our consciousness. Instead, maybe our consciousness just shifts to another timeline, a different branch of reality where that death didn't happen.
It's like Schrodinger's cat on a massive scale. Every possible reality exists until, well, how do we know which one we're experiencing?
Until maybe one of those realities becomes the one our consciousness experiences. Schrodinger's cat, that thought experiment, shows how multiple quantum states can exist at the same time until we observe them and force a specific outcome. Maybe consciousness works kind of like that, where our awareness continues on a different path in the multiverse instead of just ending.
So death could be an illusion, at least for our consciousness, which might just move to another reality. And the source ties this back to quantum entanglement, right? How could our consciousness be entangled across different realities?
This is where it gets super speculative, but really cool to think about. If consciousness follows the rules of quantum entanglement, where particles can be linked across huge distances or even different dimensions, then our awareness might not be limited to one point in time and space, or even just one universe. It could be part of this interconnected quantum field that spans across multiple realities.
That could explain some of those mysterious human experiences, right?
Right.
Like deja vu, intuition, or even feeling connected to loved ones who have died.
Exactly. Maybe deja vu is a brief overlap with a parallel reality where we experience something similar. Intuition could be information passing between entangled conscious states in different timelines. And maybe feeling the presence of someone who's passed away is actually a quantum entanglement that stretches across realities.
It's a lot to wrap your head around, but it definitely makes you think. So after all these mind-blowing ideas, where does Brian Cox land on the question of consciousness surviving death?
The source makes it clear that even with all these possibilities and theories, Brian Cox is still approaching this from a scientific perspective. He recognizes how strange quantum mechanics is and what the observer effect might mean for consciousness, but he stresses that we need actual, verifiable evidence to prove any kind of life after death.
So he's not saying it's impossible, but the burden of proof is on the people who believe it, right?
Right. But here's the key takeaway. Even with his skepticism, Cox admits that science hasn't fully cracked the code of consciousness. If quantum physics does hold the answers, then we're just scratching the surface of understanding how it all works.
That leaves room for some pretty wild possibilities. And speaking of wild, the source talks about using quantum AI to, wait for it, preserve consciousness. Sounds like something straight out of sci-fi.
I know, right? But if you follow the logic, it makes sense. If consciousness is basically information, and if quantum computers become powerful enough to create really accurate models of the brain at the quantum level, then maybe, just maybe, we could store that information, our consciousness, digitally. It's definitely a long way off, but it's a possibility.
Uploading our minds to a quantum computer for some kind of digital immortality.
Yeah.
That's a huge idea. How could that even work?
The idea is to create a detailed map of all the neural connections and, importantly, the quantum states that make up a person's consciousness. Then you could, in theory, store that information and maybe even transfer it to a super advanced quantum system so that person could exist in some form even after their body is gone.
That brings up a ton of questions, doesn't it? The source mentions some of the potential issues with this technology.
Definitely. It would change everything about how we see ourselves, what it means to be alive, what death even is. If you could live on digitally, would that still be you? What would life and death even mean if physical death wasn't the end? And what about the potential for inequality if only certain people could afford this technology? The source even suggests it could mess with our minds, knowing we might not actually die.
It really makes you rethink what it means to be human. Okay, so we've got these incredibly powerful quantum computers and all these crazy possibilities, but the source admits that there are still some big, unanswered questions.
That's important to remember. Even with all the hints and potential connections that quantum mechanics offers, we're still missing some key pieces of the puzzle. Like, if consciousness can exist outside the body, why can't we control what happens to it? How can we measure or interact with this transition after death? And the biggest question, how are quantum mechanics and consciousness truly connected in a way that we can test and prove scientifically?
So even though quantum mechanics is giving us a whole new way to think about consciousness, we still have a long way to go to find definitive answers. But the source does mention that there's research going on in this area, right?
Yeah, there's a growing field of research looking at how quantum information works in living things. They're trying to figure out if quantum phenomena are more important to life and consciousness than we currently understand. Who knows what secrets these researchers might uncover?
So after this deep dive into some mind-bending stuff, what's the main takeaway? What should our listeners be thinking about?
I think the key point is that quantum computing and the laws of quantum physics are hinting that consciousness might not disappear when we die. It's a pretty big challenge to our traditional ideas about life and death.
And Brian Cox's perspective, as we see in the source, reminds us that we still have a lot to learn about consciousness.
Definitely. He says we don't fully understand consciousness yet, which means these unusual ideas could be explored and maybe even proven by future scientific discoveries.
So here's something to think about. Could science, through the weird and wonderful world of quantum mechanics, one day prove what many philosophies and spiritual traditions have believed for ages, that there's some kind of afterlife or that consciousness continues in some way? Or does all this point to the need to completely rethink how we understand reality itself? It's a pretty deep set of questions to keep exploring.